and welcome to this episode of Arts Ably in Conversation. My name is Diane Collin. This series presents artists, academics, and project leaders who dedicate their time and energy to a better accessibility for people with disabilities in the arts. You can find more of these conversations on our website, artsably.com, which is spelled artsably.com. Today, Arts Ably is in conversation with Dr. Jessica Holmes, Assistant Professor of Musicology at the University of Copenhagen. Her research analyzes the representation of disability in contemporary Western popular music, with emphasis on vocality, embodiment, and identity formation. Hello, Jessica.
Hi,
Welcome
Diane.
to the show. So Jessica Holmes is an assistant professor of musicology at the University of Copenhagen, and she completed her PhD at McGill University in Montreal. She's also the founder of the Arts and Health Research Group in her university. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. So my name is Jessica Holmes, and I'm a musician, an interdisciplinary music scholar, a teacher, a mentor, and an advocate with expertise in music and disability. I first got interested in the academic study of music through my background as a classically trained cellist and singer. So I was very active in my church choir from a young age. My father is a Protestant minister, so the church played a very important role in my musical education. I also took private voice lessons as a teenager, and I attended Cardinal Carter Academy for the Arts in Toronto, which is a performing arts high school where I played in the orchestra as a cellist. Following high school, not unsurprisingly, I did a Bachelor of Music at Western University. And while there, I had the opportunity to take some upper division undergraduate music history seminars, which I found to be utterly inspiring. And so I abandoned my plans to attend law school to pursue an MA in musicology at Western and eventually a PhD in musicology at McGill, where I was the recipient of the Vanier Canada Graduate Scholarship for my dissertation on music, disability, and embodiment in contemporary performance. And following my PhD, I worked for 4 years at UCLA, first as a postdoctoral fellow of musicology, and then as a departmental lecturer of musicology, where I taught courses in musicology and in the disability studies minor at UCLA. Fast forward to 2011, 2021, I should say, not 2011, when I began my current tenure track appointment at the University of Copenhagen, where, as you mentioned, I teach courses in musicology and popular music studies and serve as the founding chair of the interdisciplinary art and health research cluster in the Department of Arts and Cultural Studies.
And today you are an assistant professor over there. So what brought you to Copenhagen?
It in a way was quite random. I was on the job market as a postdoctoral fellow and applying for jobs in North America, in the UK, and in Europe. This was an opportunity. This was a position that was calling for expertise in popular music studies, which is a focus of my work on music and disability. And it just so happened that they hired me. So I was very open to living in Europe and excited about the opportunity to learn about academic life in a new country and in a different, I should say, system of higher education.
Okay, thank you. I would be interested in knowing more about your research because I know you've done a lot of work in disability in music. That's how I know you, and I admire everything you've done in terms of essays and writing about, for example, your Beethoven studies and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about your research?
Absolutely. So my scholarship examines the representation of disability in contemporary popular music with attention to questions of vocality, embodiment, and identity formation. And this is work that's really located at the intersections of disability studies, deaf studies, and MAD studies, um, and bridges these perspectives with work in musicology, pop music studies, sound studies, voice studies, and increasingly feminist media studies. So perhaps I can talk a little bit about my interest in music and disability before elaborating on my research projects. This is an interest that really stems from my deep and long-standing familial ties to disability. My late paternal grandfather had post-polio syndrome and was a motorized scooter user. And it was through our regular visits and outings that I learned that the built environment isn't necessarily designed for people on wheels, at least not consistently in the 90s and in the early 2000s. My late maternal grandfather had noise-induced hearing loss for most of his adult life as a result of his prolonged exposure to industrial noise as the head of a large contracting company in Victoria, British Columbia. And my paternal uncle has been profoundly deaf since birth. So it was through witnessing the invisible labors that both my late maternal grandfather and my paternal uncle undertook and undertake to compensate for the failures of the built environment and the technological constraints of their hearing aids, such as lip reading, observing bodily gesture to intuit meaning, oftentimes before words are spoken, uh, their visual, spatial, and rhythmic propensity for music and the like, these types of things that got me interested in further exploring the relationship between disability and music and really investigating disability both as a lived experience and as an aesthetic category. Uh, as you know, the interdisciplinary field of disability studies maintains that what constitutes a disability, our definition of disability, isn't inherent in biology or in the natural world, but is rather tied to the structural inequalities of the built environment, different implicit sociocultural norms, and socioeconomic systems of power. So in my work on music and disability, I'm really interested in examining how music participates in the complex sociocultural construction of disability alongside other positions of marginality and categories of identity like gender, like sexuality, race, class, and also age. Uh, and in these ways, I really aim to embed and center disability theory and the lived experience of disability in music studies to impart a more diverse conception of music and human biocultural diversity in the process. And this is a research agenda that really culminates after these many years in two distinct areas of expertise represented by my two current book projects. The first is on deaf ontologies of sound and music, which you already mentioned. And the second is devoted to the aesthetics of mental health, gender, and race in contemporary pop music.
Okay, and so these books, can you tell a bit more about these books and how, when are we going to see these books, where you are in the process and the content, of course, a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Under contract with the University of Michigan Press for its Music and Social Justice series is my first book, Music at the Margins of Sense. And this is a book that challenges the prevailing misconceptions associated with deafness in Western music through analyzing the creative endeavors of musicians from across the diverse audiological and sociocultural spectrum of deafness, including Scottish percussionist Dame Evelyn Glennie, Berlin-based sound artist Christine Sun Kim, DJ Troy Lee, who's the director of the UK-based Deaf Rave Collective, among many others. The book really argues for a multisensory, multimodal conception of musicianship, what I simply call expert listening, that defies passive, sense by sense constructions of the sensorium, the biological certainty ascribed to so-called normal hearing, and the idealized listening subject implicit in Western music discourse. An expert listening, this conception of musicianship that I champion in the book, takes as its point of departure the disability rights movement's universal demand for control, clear from their slogan, "Nothing about us without us," meaning that disabled people need be at the forefront of knowledge formation and policy making about their lives. And I take this very seriously, given my own positionality as a white, able-bodied woman with hearing and speaking privilege, entering into the deaf community and needing to take great care to responsibly manage these power dynamics as I engage with my interlocutors. Expert listening is also rooted in what medical anthropologist Cassandra Hartblay calls disability expertise. That is, quote, the particular knowledge that disabled people develop and enact about unorthodox configurations of agency, cultural norms, and relationships between bodies, selves, and the designed world, end quote. So expert listening really tries to work against an ideally sensing deaf person, to draw on deaf anthropologist Michelle Friedner's verbiage. And what I mean by an ideally sensing deaf person is this idea that a deaf person inhabits a world of complete and utter silence, so that deafness is a state of absolute auditory silence, but has an innate ability, by virtue of the ostensible compensatory mechanisms of the deaf brain, to make up for that loss through the sense of touch, and therefore for that deafness automatically bestows this inborn ability to experience music in a heightened way through the sense of touch. And the book really tries to work against those cultural mythologies, that ideally sensing deaf person, by really foregrounding the individual modalities and means by which my interlocutors engage with music, oftentimes through reframing and redefining what music can be from an ontological standpoint, whether that means through highlighting the musicality of visual spatial gesture, the kinesthetic dynamics of rhythm relative to the perceptual limits of pitch, the creative affordances of music technology and musical instruments designed to mitigate against tinnitus and music-induced hearing loss and the like. So that's the essence of Music at the Margins of Sense. I hope to see it in print sometime in late 2025. I'm currently revising the manuscript. It's gone through a first round of peer review, and I'm hopeful that the process will continue to go smoothly.
Thank you. And what about your second book then?
Yeah, so my second book project, which is in its very nascent stages of development, is tentatively titled The Musical Vernacular of Depression. And it analyzes the representation of depression in contemporary pop music as it reflects both on the increasing statistical prevalence of clinical depression among young people and its associated gender and racial inequalities, and the increasing thematic ubiquity of depression in contemporary popular music. The book really tries to reframe depression, or newly frame depression, as a coherent aesthetic category with distinct semantic practices, stylistic conventions, and affective cultures. What I think of as an emerging musical vernacular of depression that blurs a biomedical construction of depression as a common and serious mood disorder with a generational sensibility that is unbounded by diagnosis and pathology. So the book examines musicians' disclosures of depression, the popularization of internet-based microgenres like ASMR, bedroom pop, and emo rap, the algorithmic logics of Spotify's mood-based listening, and different musical trends on TikTok, and how these contribute to the aesthetic consolidation of the musical vernacular of depression. I really argue that in these ways, pop music transforms the way in which young people, or the ways in which young people conceive of, communicate about, and tend to their mental health. And in so doing, I really seek to position pop music, or to think of pop music as a medically unregulated site of public mental health discourse, in order to deepen our humanistic understanding of the relationship between biomedicine and pop culture, and psychiatric understandings of depression and social inequality. So I should say that my recent article in the current issue of the Journal of the American Musicological Society on Billie Eilish and the feminist aesthetics of depression serves as a springboard and proof of concept for this second book project.
And in this second book project, I guess that there is always this conversation about critical disability studies and the medical and social model, especially in depression and topics like that, because it's really related to the medical model. But I assume that you are exploring the social part of that too, right?
Absolutely. It's a great question. One of the interventions the book hopes to make is to really carve out new theoretical ground through which to understand depression as it overlaps and departs from the lived experiences and the discursive logics of disability, of madness, and of melancholy. So I do approach depression in the same way that I approach disability, as a sociocultural construct in many respects. And in so doing, I'm indebted to the work of scholars like Anne Svetkovich, who calls for the depathologization of depression. She thinks of depression in relationship to neoliberal capitalism, and neoliberal capitalism as creating the conditions in which depression can thrive. At the same time, I recognize that for many people who live with depression, and through my own personal experiences, there is tremendous power in thinking of depression as a biochemical imbalance of the brain, or as a disease, or as a disorder. So there's a sense in which pop music can teach us about that relationship between culture, or the social model of depression, and the biomedical model of depression. Pop music really blurs those divisions and offers an aesthetic perspective on a very complex human experience, one that is approached in the popular consciousness with a considerable degree of urgency, right? We hear often about depression as a public health crisis. We are often also told that depression is a leading cause of disability worldwide. So there is a certain degree of complexity and ambiguity and urgency with respect both to the prevalence of depression and its uneasy relationship to disability.
That's fascinating. I also wanted to go back briefly to the first book project. Could you give examples of, because we talked a lot about the theory behind the book, but practically, when you mention other ways of listening, other ways of living music or experiencing music through these artists that you are mentioning in your book, and also these idea of creating instruments to mitigate or to transform this the tinnitus experience. Can you give us examples of practically what are these instruments, or what are examples of things that you discussed with these artists to have this idea of the experience of a person with deafness living music?
Absolutely. I can give three different concrete examples that I think speak to the diverse conception of musicianship that the book advocates for, as one that spans so-called formal musical training and autodidactic forms of musical education. So let's start with Evelyn Glennie, who is a musician that you know well. You visited her and you've taken a tour of her percussion studio. And she is perhaps one of the most visible deaf musicians of our age. As you know, Evelyn Glennie practices her signature listening through touch, or touching the sound, sensing music through vibrations, using the percussion instrument to draw out the sound, to really circumvent the sort of usual ideological means of access by practicing this deeply embodied form of listening that is interdependent with her instruments, right? And we know she has a vast and very exciting collection of percussion instruments. So we see in Evelyn Glennie's example a musician who practices this holistic conception of listening that also engages visual spatial cues as well as tactility and rhythm. And Evelyn Glennie does have the benefit of a formal musical education. Deafness is this, as I mentioned earlier, very plural and diverse experience. There is no monolithic deaf experience of music. And as you know, Evelyn began to lose her hearing around the age of 9. So she did have the benefit of a formal musical training before the onset of her hearing loss, but over the years was able to unlearn and relearn new ways of engaging with music and engaging with sound, while also drawing on her very strong background in music performance. Then we have the example of Christine Sun Kim, who is profoundly deaf, who communicates primarily using sign language. Her artistic practice as a sound artist centers on what she calls unlearning sound etiquette. That is the implicit hearing norms that she internalized from a young age, governing when and when not to make sounds. An invisible social contract that really divides along hearing and deaf lines. So she's really reclaiming a sense of ownership over sound from the hearing world. And in Christine Sun Kim's example, we see her engaging with non-sonorous, oftentimes, articulations of music, as in her Face Opera, which is a piece scored for 9 prelingually deaf performers, whereby they sing using silent facial gesture from the American Sign Language Lexicon, which is a piece that challenges the fundamental, that challenges our understanding of music insofar as sound is a fundamental precondition for music, right? She really makes the case that music can exist independent of sound. In her iconic visual music, she repurposes symbols from Western musical notation along witty written cues from her everyday experiences as a woman, a deaf woman of color navigating the hearing world, to offer reflections on some of those experiences, and in the process really invites the listener to think more deeply and more expansively about about music and about entry points to music and to sound, framing music as, once again, a deeply embodied experience that engages the whole of the sensorium. And the final example that I can speak to is American-born Dutch-based violinist Monica Germino, who is an experimental violinist. She used to play with Bang on a Can Collective. Many years ago, Monica developed what's called hyperacusis, which in medical terms is a disorder of loudness perception that often causes severe acoustic pain and physical discomfort in certain registers, or certain timbres could prove triggering. Uh, so in and around the time that her audiologist suggested that she cease from playing violin, several of her friends got together to co-compose a theatrical suite to explore the potential of low decibel violin music. And this was a suite that was scored for low decibel violin and mutes, and one in which she used her whisper violin, which was designed by a luthier as a low decibel frame violin to mitigate against the effects of her hyperacusis while also protecting existing hearing thresholds. And I really think of Monica's violin playing and the ways in which she retooled her violin playing and reframed her relationship to the violin as a kind of auditory self-regulation, a self-directed treatment protocol, if you will, beyond medically regulated channels that once again help to make up for the failures and perils of a dysregulated sonic environment. Once again, shifting the onus of deficit and compensation away from the deaf sensorium onto the built environment. So this whisper violin and this theatrical suite muted composed for low decibel violins is an example of one of these ways in which a person with noise-induced hearing loss and hyperacusis engages with music, perhaps by defying certain aesthetic conventions and even the norms, the acoustical norms of the built musical environment.
These are really fascinating examples. And it's a good segue to my next question, which is really looking at accessibility in the arts. And I wonder what accessibility in the arts means for you.
So in my work on music and disability, I'm really interested in exploring the dynamic tension and reciprocity between the musician's body and the physical limitations of and the creative affordances of the designed world. And I hinted at this earlier. Insofar as customary portrayals of music and deafness are concerned, I'm really interested in shifting the burden of deficit and compensation away from the presumed failures and the innate plasticity of the deaf sensorium onto the built environment by foregrounding the disabling and enabling capacities of what musicologist Blake Howe refers to as the constructed normalcy of music performance. And there he's invoking Leonard J. Davis when he talks about constructed normalcy within the context of disability. And I'm going to quote Howe He says, just as architectural features of society have the potential to exclude and stigmatize bodily difference, so too do the conventions of music performance frame certain actions, behaviors, and appearances as disabling. And what I gather from Howe's description is that music transpires and is experienced within and through a built aesthetic environment with a naturalized set of corporeal biases, physical biases and conventions, from instrument design to concert venues and sound systems to sound recording and production technology to music software design to the modalities and literacies of different music media. And to Howe's point, the physical habitus associated with some of these conventions, with some of these objects, with some of these spaces are accessible or are either accessible or inaccessible to the extent that they have the capacity to enable and disable. And I'm thinking especially here in terms of um, literal access, what Bess Williamson describes as literal access. That is one's ability, and I'm quoting from Williamson here, one's ability to enter, move about within, and operate the facilities of a site. So we can think about literal access in the musical realm along those same lines. So in my work, I really think about the question, how do musicians from across the diverse ideological and sociocultural spectrum of disability or deafness approach, mediate, circumvent, and in some cases altogether reject the aesthetic constraints and implicit hearing norms of music discourse or sound etiquette, to draw on Christine Sun Kim's characterization, by foregrounding the multisensory and multimodal aspects of musicianship, spanning both sonorous and non-sonorous conceptions of music and sound. So in that sense, I think a lot about this active, dynamic notion of music perception and creation, where disability, and here I'm going to quote from Howe once again, engenders the flourishing of new, different, and intrinsically valuable modes of music making that are unbounded ultimately, and these are my words, by some of the restrictions and constraints of conventional music making.
It's funny that you're mentioning Blake Howe, because when you were talking about your book, I was thinking of some of his writing, like the articles about the 100 Pianist, for example, where he was talking about the perception of the different perception of an audience while listening and watching a performer with disability, and in this case a 100 Pianist, in a like a public sphere and a public understanding of the music and reception of the music. And I was thinking of that, these writings. So thank you for quoting Blake Howe. I think that's
Yeah.
it's a great example of academic connections.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. I think I'm very indebted to Blake Howe as a mentor, colleague, and as a writer. I think he is a beautiful writer, and to my mind, his work is foundational to music and disability studies as a subfield of music studies. So I'm glad that you find his work meaningful and generative too.
He is also someone very approachable with whom we can talk and we can debate and exchange. So it's
Yeah.
plus you're right about the fact that really he was among the first people to really write in an academic world and decide to bring together scholars to edit this first book about disability studies and music. And then many others appeared after that. And so really all his work has been also very influential to my own
Yeah.
research. So thank you for that.
Of course, that's wonderful.
To conclude, I have a question about inspirations. So we just mentioned several scholars and several artists who inspired our different works. And I had this idea of maybe there is always in our mind someone like this one person that we would like to meet or that we would like to talk with and converse about this inspiration. And I was wondering if you had one person uh, who is active in the field of music, intersections between disability and music, maybe in the arts, who would it be?
This is going to sound terribly cliche, but I would have to say Joni Mitchell for a few different reasons. First, and Joni's music figures prominently in my coming of age story, in my understanding of womanhood and my own singing voice and songwriting, having discovered her music in my first year of college. So I've always been an admirer of and lover of Joni Mitchell's music. And second, like my late paternal grandfather, she contracted polio during one of the major outbreaks of the 20th century. And this is an experience that has had a lasting impact on her musical craft as she sought to devise unorthodox guitar tunings that more readily corresponded to the unique architecture of her hand. And once again, to return to some of your questions around accessibility and in particular Blake Howe's discussion of musicianship and the ways in which, again, and I'll quote from Howe, disability engenders this sort of flourishing of new and intrinsically valuable modes of music making. I think her work is a shining example of that, and the ways in which some of the conventions of music, the ways in which disability can sort of unsettle some of the conventions of music performance and playing technique in ways that are unbounded, that are really unbounded and imaginative.
Thank you so much for your work and for your words. It was a fantastic discussion. I really enjoyed it. And all the best for your books and your upcoming projects and your teaching in Copenhagen, everything.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, Diana. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And yes, we will publish some of the links to the resources that you mentioned on Arts Église website.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.